afternoon, everybody. And once again, thanks to ACS for the opportunity to be here today. I really appreciate it. So to Michael, Ethan, and the rest of the team, once again, thank you all very much. Following on from Alistair, I'm just going to cover off on probably three things. So first thing I'll talk about is I guess, those enrolment trends that we typically talk about and what we're seeing across the sector there. I'll talk a little bit about the regulatory environment, so which parts of that will dovetail nicely, I think, to what Alistair was just talking about. And then finally talk about some of the new initiatives that we're rolling through at ISQ as well, just to make sure that they're on your radar. So let's start where we typically start. Even a bit more minutes away. There we go. So this is the overall enrolment trends for independent schools across Queensland. So 4% growth in the last 12 months, and I think it's pretty extraordinary when you think about it. It's an additional circa 40,000 to 50,000 children over the last decade that have moved into independent schooling. So the growth rate has been significant and it has stayed pretty consistently strong for the last 5 years. And what that means is, and again, what we do like to do is just have a look at that in relation to the other sectors. So the growth rate in independent schooling continues to outstrip the Catholic sector and certainly continues to outstrip the state sector. The pie chart that you can see there as well, probably in the next 12 to 18 months to 2 years, the independent sector, if these growth rates continue, will actually be larger than the Catholic sector in Queensland based on that ongoing growth. So there's obviously a trend coming out of COVID that has now been really embedded over the last 4 or 5 years in terms of families really wanting to choose a school that meets their needs and obviously finding that in the independent sector. So to unpack that a little bit more, and appreciate this might be challenging to read the room, so I'm sure Ethan will happily flip around the prezzo if anybody wants it. This just shows where that student growth is by a local government area, and it's in raw numbers, so it's just total student number increases. So the largest local government areas that we've seen significant growth are in South East Queensland in terms of raw numbers. So places like Logan, Gold Coast, Morgan, Brisbane, Ipswich, and the Sunshine Coast, with about nearly 4,500 or a bit over 4,500 more students in South East Queensland in the last 12 months, and about 2,000, and about another 1,400 students outside of South East Queensland. But interestingly, when you flip that around, and this is percentages. So, sorry, did I skip through that the wrong way? What this shows is actually, when you look at it in percentage terms, the percentage of growth outside of South East Queensland is more significant than the percentage growth inside South East Queensland, which I can interpret as meaning there's strong growth right across the state, right? So we're seeing in raw numbers in South East Queensland in terms of percentage growth outside of South East Queensland weekend, which is really, really positive. As many of you in the room would be aware, a lot of where that is about supply and capacity of the schools that are there to actually take on more students. We continue to see really strong growth in the number of special assistance schools and the number of students attending special assistance schools. So we're now up to, I think, 27 schools across Queensland with well over 58 campuses. And we've seen compound annual growth rates in the order of 25% for the past few years in special assistance schools. Special assistance schools were about, or students in special assistance schools were about 25% of the overall growth in the number of independent school students last year, and now make up a bit over 5% of total enrolments across the sector as well. This probably won't come as too much as a surprise, but growth in secondary education is outpacing primary education, with secondary education representing about 57% or 60% of total enrolments across the sector. Distance ed, I think we're seeing maybe a rebound or normalisation, or others in the room might have a better view around where this stands. We're coming back out of that sort of surge we saw in COVID, then a dip, and then a bit of a regrowth in the sector. We're seeing again some positive growth in distance education numbers in independent schools across Queensland as well, with this accounting for about 8% of the total growth across the sector as well. And a not too dissimilar story with international students. So again, coming out of COVID, we saw that dip off the back of all the challenges that everyone experienced there, but we're starting to see those numbers grow back strongly across the sector as well. And boarding, to be honest, remains fairly stable. I think most of our boarding schools are at or near capacity, and that's probably about what we'll see going forward. And again, we continue to see growing numbers of Indigenous students enrolled in independent schools as well, which is fantastic. I won't labour this because you'll know it too well. A huge amount of opportunity through VET in our schools continues to be offered. And of course, because we're seeing all that growth, and no doubt you're all feeling it in terms of your own schools as well, that's translating into a larger number of people on board in the sector as well. So year on year, teacher growth continues, and so does total staff employment as well. So I guess the summary of all of that is the same as it has been the last few years, which is it's a sector that is growing, and that we're seeing families increasingly make the choice to want to send their children to independent schools. Probably what we're talking about now, and we're working really closely with the VGA around this as well, is that our concern, if you put your hat on for what does it look like in the next 20 or 30 years, is are we going to be able to continue to supply opportunities for parents to choose independent schools if we can't figure out how to build more schools and more classrooms right across the state. So, you know, where my eyes do, I'm very much about wanting to make sure that parents have that choice into the future as well. And so that's something that we're looking at really closely and working with the VGA on. Now, the good news is in future you won't need to listen to me droll on about this because we've actually put all of this information on the Member Hub on the ISQ webpage. So if you need to do a board presentation or anything else like that, all of this sector-wide data from within the next fortnight, we'll launch it. It'll be up there for you to be able to draw down on and to be able to use as you see fit in your own organisations as well. So everything that I've covered off there, and I'll let more, you'll be able to slice and dice to be able to find various bits of information that you might need. And that's sort of a new next phase in that decision support platform that we've been developing for schools. I'll talk a little bit about the economic outlook, but I don't really want to talk about this too much because I think we all consume this information every day in the media. We're obviously seeing inflation coming back down, which is a positive sign in terms of future understanding future challenges, but we continue to be in a really, I think, volatile economic environment. We're not necessarily quite sure what the next 2 months, let alone 2 years, looks like in terms of the impact of international and local decisions on the economic conditions. Probably one of the things that we are talking to schools a little bit about is that we have been through this cycle of increased inflation where the broad community has understood and perhaps expected costs to increase, including fee increases to be more than what they might have historically been. As we move into this lower inflation environment, I guess we have a little bit of concern that it's going to create quite a crunch point for schools in that we know that school costs, because of salary costs, building costs and a range of other things, are probably going to be above CPI. But the community's expectation is probably going to be cost increases at or around CPI. And the disconnect between those two things might cause a bit of friction. You know, if you're running a business out there and you're able to increase your costs by 2.5%, and that's all the market's going to take, but your kids are enrolled in a school and the school's asking for a 5+% fee increase, you might be wondering why that's the case. So I think those things are probably important to keep in the back of your mind over the next couple of years as we move back into this more rated environment with inflation. I won't worry about this one. I'll talk a little bit about, I guess, some of the issues that are top of mind. I just picked 4 there just to flag a few orders to make sure they're on your radar, and certainly Alistair touched on one of those. But the first one I'll start with is actually the 4th one there, which hopefully you would have seen something come out from us or the Commonwealth in the last week or so, which is about a 12-month delay or a rollover of CTC scores for next year. So what a number of you will have battled over the last few years is being advised by the Commonwealth of what your CTC score is in November, with your budgets already locked in, decisions already made about what you'll do in the following year, and needing to then reverse engineer that in terms of fees and a number of other challenges. The Federal Minister has listened to what we've been talking to him about, and also I say that that's incredibly challenging for schools to be able to do that. So what he's going to do is delay the implementation of the new CTC score for 12 months. That's a long way of saying what your CTC score today is will be what it is next year, and you can plan a budget around that. And if we can't get the Commonwealth to bring the time frame forward in terms of releasing that information, we would be aiming for that 12-month delay to sit there in perpetuity as well. But that's something that we need to work through. I'm happy to take questions on that at the end if people would like. So in terms of some of these other issues, I thought I'd give a bit of an update on where things are at with the Non-State Schools Accreditation Board review. This is obviously something that's now been tickling along for a number of years, with some positive movement in some directions that we're really happy with, and obviously a bit of frustration maybe that some things aren't moving as fast as we'd like to see them. So I thought maybe I'd touch on a few things that have been happening in this space. So I think first and foremost, most of you will be aware that the new education guideline was released recently, and that's been a lot of work behind the scenes with the QCW and ASAP board and stakeholders to really give schools a greater level of flexibility in decision making around their curriculum, which will then enable them, which would then be which would NASAD be reflecting in its work and understanding that schools have that greater level of flexibility than they've had in the past. So there's quite a positive move there, which was, to the credit of everyone involved, moved relatively quickly and got out there relatively recently. There's probably three other things in this space that are worth noting. So one, those of you that operate boarding schools will probably be aware that there's been movement towards the development of a boarding standard under NASAD to make sure that NASAD has appropriate powers to monitor boarding schools. That work is continuing, and we would expect by the end of this year that there would be some sort of boarding standard developed and in place ready for implementation. Sitting alongside that, the NASAD review identified the need to develop a wellbeing standard, which would be implemented and assessed by NASAD. Positively, and I don't have this in writing, so there's an asterisk here now, but hopefully the next couple of weeks it will be in writing. The government's decided to pause any movement on a wellbeing standard because the Child Safe Organisations Act is coming into play and largely covers off all of those issues in terms of the requirements that will sit with the QFCC. So we've been working really hard to make sure there wasn't sort of a dual lane thing going on where there was a wellbeing standard with NASAD and the QFCC was running off and doing something else. And where we've got to is that work that's already legislated that Alistair was referring to, that the Child and Family Commissioner will be implementing from the 1st of next year, will effectively be the requirement for the wellbeing standard for NASAD, which is good news. The third point there is something to make sure that's top of mind right now. So a couple of weeks ago, the Minister wrote to NASAD and he directed them to undertake an audit of 10% of non-government schools' child protection arrangements. So 10% of the schools in this room in the next few weeks will be notified that you're part of effectively a random audit of your policies, and so you want to make sure, I think, that you're getting ready for that. I think if I could pick up on where Alistair was talking about some of these matters, and I think he used the word, make sure that there's prompt reporting of incidents to the authorities. NASAD prefers the word immediate. So if you are looking at your policies, you might want to think about the word immediate and making sure the word immediate is in your policies. And if I've said immediate enough to make sure that's in there, then I've done my job today, I think. So you might want to do that immediately when you get back to school and make sure that all of that is where it needs to be. Finally, look, another piece of work that's here, and I think Alistair touched on this as well. We're in a different environment now because we've got a different state government to what we've had in the past, which means that there's a different focus area for the government. And similarly, I agree with Alistair, even though we've got a return to Commonwealth government, we don't quite have clarity on what that agenda looks like with them yet, so we're in a bit of a state of transition. But clearly, the new state government has a focus on red tape reduction, and so we're doing what we can to try and work with them to identify opportunities to reduce red tape on schools. So if I can give you some silly examples around that that we're looking at, I don't know, this said people in the room here, you've got to have an accredited site to operate distance education. My view is that's a whole heap of grown-ups going to an office building, so why do you need to have an accredited site for a distance education provider? Couldn't that be something that's just dealt with in the same as any other provider who's using office-based grown-ups? So why does there need to be an accredited site for that? We're looking at things like the state census. There's already a Commonwealth census, it captures largely the same data. Do we need to have a second round of data collection every year at a cost to schools to do that when other jurisdictions rely on the Commonwealth census? Things like, for those of you that might have kindergartens and the requirement to provide a transition note to the QCAA for students that are going from your kindergarten into your prep. That seems like a waste of everybody's time and energy. Could that be removed if the student is transitioning within the same school from kinder to prep? Things like that. They're not revolutionary, but there's an opportunity there with a new government to take away some of those nuisancey type things. So if there's anything like that that you want to make sure gets on our list, please make sure you do that and we'll put it forward. I won't cover on this because Alistair really talked around what's going on with the QFCC and the obligations that come in from the beginning of next year. So I'll leave that there, but happy to take any questions on that towards the end. And then the last piece that I thought I'd talk a little bit about is some of the initiatives that we've got going on at ISQ that you'll hopefully see roll through over the next few months as well. So the first of those I touched on earlier, which is a lot of that data being put more at your fingertips through the member hub, which you'll start to see roll through in the next couple of weeks. The other one that hopefully you've seen us looking into is we're doing a fair bit of work to better understand the independent school workforce. What are the drivers of people who choose to work in independent schools, and what does that mean for us in terms of thinking about attracting and retaining the best staff into the future as well. So you may have seen we did, partnered with PeopleBench to undertake a survey of schools across the state. We had 88 schools participate in that with I think well over 3,000 individual staff members provide that information. We'll be releasing that the insights out of that next week, which really speak to some of the differences that people are looking for in terms of why they might choose to work in an independent school as compared to other parts of the education workforce. And also it talks to what are some of the things that we need to think about as a sector in order to attract and retain people into the future. So things like what does flexibility look like for the teaching workforce into the future if the rest of the workforce out there has a different view of flexibility to what might have been the case 10 years ago. So some interesting material will come forward out of that. Sitting alongside that, we snagged the domain name teachingqueensland.com.au, and what we're looking to do is marry up a lot of that information that we're generating around why people choose to work in independent schools and turn that into an outcome-facing promotion exercise to make sure that our schools have the opportunity to, again, attract and retain the best people out there. Initially, this is something that we're looking at in terms of helping you recruit locally, but certainly the intention in the coming months and years is for this to transition into something that can help us recruit internationally as well. So when we think about people that are different parts of the world that might think about teaching in Australia, to think about teaching in Queensland and teaching in an independent school first, because they're getting the best information from us more readily. So you'll see there, we've started pulling information in there which is around helping people understand what might be required to migrate and do a whole range of other things like that. In time, we're having to roll that into potentially more deliberate action offshore as well to hopefully attract and retain. Understanding that's a zero-sum game, that means someone else has lost a teacher somewhere else in the world, but our focus is on making sure that you have access to the content. The final thing that's coming through in the next couple of weeks is, I'm sure many of you over the years have seen our What Parents Want survey, which is really, I think it's nearly 20, or a bit over 20 years now. It's a longitudinal survey that we've done to understand why parents have chosen an independent school. We do it every 4 years to see what we get, both in terms of this year's real data, but also those longitudinal trends. And we'll be releasing that next week as well. For schools that had more than, I think it's 10 parents provide input, you'll get an individualised report as well. We'll do that a bit differently to what we've done in the past. We used to give you a hard copy thing, but again, we'll be loading that up on our Data Hub website, so you'll be able to log into your school and see your school's data and be able to have a look at that and the trends over a period of time as well, so keep an eye out for that. And last but by no means least, we're also looking at supporting schools to get a better deal on insurance where it's appropriate for them as well. So we've been looking at that issue and certainly understand that it's a complicated environment and working closely with schools to understand what that looks like. But we know that it's been a pressure point for schools for a number of years and it's getting more challenging. So we want to do what we can do to influence that market to make sure that schools have the best deal that they can. You know, as we all know, one of the great things about independent schools is their independence, but what that sometimes means is we don't get to hunt as a pack and get the same sort of outcomes as those that can. So this is an example where we're trying to do a little bit of that as well. And they're the things that I was aiming on covering off today. So I appreciate that. I think towards the end of the day, so I was trying not to hold you too far back from a drink and a look out at the ocean. But any questions that anybody might have, I'm happy to take. No, the drink in the ocean is too alluring. We'll go with that. Thank you all very much.